The 2012 Formula One season is considered by many to be the greatest Formula One season in the history of the illustrious sport. The season included 7 different race winners in the first 7 races, Nico's first victory, Michael's phantom pole, Webber's final victory, the miracle of Maldonado at Spain, Alonso's final title fight, his real final shot, McLaren's last win. The 2012 season also saw the return of former world champion in 2007, Kimi Räikkönen. Today's battle-hardened veterans were forged as the likes of Perez, Ricciardo, Grosjean, and Hülkenberg all came through, especially in 2012. On top of all that, there were 6 world champions on the grid at the exact same time. The drama began even in preseason, where Ferrari did not look like themselves, and McLaren looked like the car to beat that year. We start the story by looking at Australia, round 1. Ferrari's preseason woes carried into Australia round 1, where they qualified 12th and 16th on the grid. Also consistent with preseason testing, McLaren locked out the front row, with Lewis Hamilton taking pole position and Jenson Button right behind him. Button's weekend only got that much better when he overtook Lewis Hamilton going into the first corner. The 2009 driver world champion never looked back, and he took victory in that first race. Not the best of starts after earning pole for Hamilton, as he dropped back to P3 after Vettel overtook him after a VSC. The top 5 were rounded out by Mark Webber getting P4 and Alonso earning P5. Round 2, Malaysia. The drivers were met with heavy rain at the Malaysia Grand Prix. Similar to Hamilton's dominance in 2019, McLaren yet again locked out the front row as Lewis Hamilton took his second consecutive pole. This is also the round where we start to notice Lewis is having trouble in the pits, and it's going to be a consistent theme. A delayed pit stop took Lewis out of contention of winning this race after rain had actually stopped the Grand Prix and restarted it. Fernando Alonso inherited that lead, and an unlikely candidate emerged in Malaysia. We see Sergio Perez actually step into second place, chasing down Fernando Alonso. And not only was he trailing Alonso and chasing him, he was gaining on him. The track was clearly drying up, and Daniel Ricciardo actually triggered a massive wave of pit stops. Sergio found himself on the tail end of that wave of pit stops, and it hurt him. He was about 5 seconds behind Alonso now. But it didn't matter. Sergio, in the rain, began to catch Alonso yet again, and it looked like he was probably going to catch him. And then a simple error ruined his potential to have his first race win. With just 7 laps to go, he actually ran wide at turn 14 and lost a ton of time that he was actually never able to make up. Alonso went on to take his first victory of the season. And while not P1, Sergio was still on the podium in P2, taking home a bunch of points that are certainly going to help him out throughout the season. Hamilton rounded out the podium at the Malaysian Grand Prix, as Mark Webber ended up P4 with Kimi Räikkönen taking P5. So after 2 rounds of Formula One racing, we have 2 different Formula One race winners. The next race in the Formula One calendar saw the emergence of another young talent, a future world champion. We're talking about, of course, Nico Rosberg, where he gets his first pole and first victory. Round 3, China. Even before the Chinese Grand Prix actually began, Lotus and Formula One had officially filed a complaint with the FIA back in preseason testing about the Mercedes rear wing. Essentially, what this claim amounted to was Mercedes had created the F-duct effect. This would exponentially improve the DRS mechanisms, as it would channel air back through the front of the car. The FIA ultimately threw out the objection, and it was decided right before the Chinese Grand Prix that Mercedes had had a legal car the whole time. So with the claims dismissed, Mercedes were allowed to race normally without altering the car, with many thought was a car with double DRS. And it became very apparent immediately that Schumacher and Rosberg were going to be quick at this track. Rosberg ended up taking his first ever pole and translated that into his first ever victory. Rosberg was helped by the fact that Hamilton had just received a gearbox infraction and was dropped down, promoting Michael Schumacher up to P2. Michael was not ultimately able to convert on this, as he ended up retiring from the race, having issues that looked a lot like Haas 2018, where he couldn't get his tire on straight. But Rosberg was not out of the clear yet. He was being hunted down, and quick, by Jenson Button. And just when it looked like Jenson Button was going to catch Nico Rosberg, consistent with McLaren's issues all year long in pit lane, Jenson Button was a victim of his garage, who actually ended up making a mistake and costing him quite a lot of time. And Kimi Räikkönen was running well. He was on par and right on pace with a second place finish. He wore his tires out and lost 11 places in a single lap. And this really woke up Rosberg's garage. Rosberg began to conserve his tires, but now he was under attack from Button, who was recovering from that horrible pit mistake. An inter-battle fiefdom between the two McLaren cars allowed Rosberg to conserve his tires, make it to the end of the race, and take P1. Button came back to take P2, and we see Hamilton actually take his third consecutive podium and his third consecutive third-place finish. And this consistency of being on the podium actually after the Chinese Grand Prix Round 3 put him in first place in the Formula 1 Championship. Button's performance and comeback was good enough to put him P2 in the Formula 1 Championship, with Fernando Alonso actually chasing in P3 after he had finished 9th place in the Chinese Grand Prix. And not to be overshadowed, Romain Grosjean actually saw himself score his first points in Formula 1, getting P6 in the Chinese Grand Prix. 3 rounds of Formula 1 racing down, 3 different race winners. As if the stakes couldn't get any higher, as if the drama couldn't be any greater. Round 4, Bahrain.
Protests have been occurring daily in the Shiite villages around Bahrain's capital, and the clashes have been intensifying in the run-up to the Formula 1 Grand Prix this weekend, an event which these protesters see as a publicity stunt by the country's rulers to make it seem like the nation is more unified than it actually is.
Despite the geopolitical tensions and all of the criticism that FIA and Formula 1 in general were receiving for racing at Bahrain, many people thought that Bahrain internally were using the race as a way to say that the country is safe and everything is fine. And it sparked a lot of protest, very, very dangerous protests for everyone involved, for the drivers, for all of the team. Out of sheer damage control and safety, it was thought that the FAA would forego the round 4 in Bahrain, but they ended up racing anyway. And this time it was Red Bull's turn to answer, as the reigning world champion had yet to win a Grand Prix. And respond they did. Sebastian Vettel took pole in Bahrain and ended up taking the victory in Bahrain. He faced relentless and continued pressure from Kimi Räikkönen, the 2007 world champion. Kimi had one opening, and even to this day people talk about, was that a double move to defend it by Vettel, but it turns out all legal, all safe. Sebastian Vettel took the victory, Kimi Räikkönen took P2, and Romain Grosjean took P3. Hamilton was a distant 8th, yet again plagued by his pit crew's inability to get him out of the garage quickly. And Webber, not necessarily doing an incredible job all season long in terms of winning races, he did get yet another 4th place finish. That, combined with Sebastian Vettel's win, put Red Bull in the lead of the Constructors' Championship in front of McLaren, which was a massive deal. Lotus's performance at the Bahrain Grand Prix put them in 3rd place in the Constructors' Championship. And while many people in certain circles and certain corners of the internet may argue about Vettel's decision to move and defend his position with Raikkonen trying to overtake there, what people talk about more is Formula One's decision to even race in Bahrain, knowing what was going on geopolitically, knowing what it signaled to the people of Bahrain if they ended up racing there. It was just a move that still is talked about and criticized heavily. But the show must go on. So that's 4 different races, 4 different winners, and we go into the 5th round. Round 5, Spain. As we continue the controversy, Lewis Hamilton took pole position, but just after finishing his lap, his car stopped. It was clear Hamilton was not running on sufficient fuel. Pastor Maldonado was waiting in the wings as he qualified P2, but inherited pole position after the penalty was given to Hamilton and he was sent to the back of the grid. Joining Maldonado on the front row was Fernando Alonso, who, that's not the best person to see next to you, as they had been racing and starting well the entire season, and Williams had yet to see a Grand Prix victory in over 100 Grand Prix starts. Not unsurprisingly, Fernando Alonso, double world champion, actually used his Ferrari to take control of the race going into the first turn. Maldonado was forced to chase Alonso until the round of pit stops actually kicked off. After the exit of the pit stops, it was clear Maldonado was going to take the lead. He actually ended up holding on to this lead, becoming the first Venezuelan driver to ever win a Grand Prix. After 130 Grand Prix starts, Williams returned to the top of the podium, something they haven't done since Juan Pablo Montoya won in Brazil in 2004. A total of 3 world titles actually joined Maldonado on top of the podium. Kimi Räikkönen was P3, with Fernando Alonso in P2. And as we keep track of the championship, the other drivers had good recoveries. Lewis Hamilton, after his penalty from the qualifying session, starting 24th in the grid, worked his way all the way back to P8. Sebastian Vettel actually had a drive-through penalty and some issues with his car, but ultimately he overtook Rosberg in the late stage of the race to give him P6, with Rosberg splitting the two. That P6 by Vettel actually kept his championship lead for the Formula One season. After a bit of shuffling throughout the Formula One ratings, we see a 5th winner and a 5th Grand Prix. Before we can even start racing, we see even more controversy as there is a massive fire in the recent winner's pit box, as Williams have to put out this giant fire that is engulfing everything in their garage, everything. In the midst of an extremely contentious and hotly contested Formula One Grand Prix season, we see the entire community come together, everyone on the grid, pulling their weight, getting what they can, grabbing extinguishers, and helping Williams not as a competitor, but more so as a loving community. It was their actions, the quick actions of everyone on the grid that helped put this fire out that ended up saving lives, likely, and even the season of Williams as they were able to put that out. Round 6, Monaco. Consistent with the entire season thus far, Monaco began with controversy as members of the grid were protesting the RB8 in parts of their floor. Red Bull took a gamble here. They knew the protests were going to come to fruition after the race, or at least that was a gamble that they had to take. If they did, Webber and Vettel would be disqualified from the race, but if they started from the back of the grid, they would be fine no matter what the decision was. Red Bull decided to race anyway, not respect the protest, and stay where they qualified. Now all that was left to do was for the Red Bull drivers to deliver, and that's exactly what they did. Despite Schumacher actually ending the qualifying session as fastest man on the timesheet, his 5-place grid penalty put him in at P6 for the start of the Grand Prix, which was great news for the RB8 as Mark Webber was promoted to P1 and on pole. Similar to Ricciardo's efforts to hold on to his victory in 2018 at Monaco, the RB8 of Mark Webber, while not engine related, was really struggling with the tires. Had it been any other circuit, there is no way he would have held that place, but he did, and it was a very close race as they went bumper to bumper to bumper, P1, P2, P3, with Webber holding on to his position, followed closely by Nico Rosberg, and right behind him, Fernando Alonso. Alonso's podium in Monaco actually kept him in P3 in the championship. And on the constructor's side, after the protest that was initially raised at the start of the Grand Prix was not actually followed through on, it turned out that Red Bull actually held on to first place in the championship. Round 7, Canada. In almost comedic relief fashion, the FIA before the Canadian Grand Prix even start declare that the RB8 in fact in Monaco was using an illegal floor. But it didn't matter because they were still able to retain the points they had earned, which doesn't make a lot of sense. Nonetheless, Red Bull went on with the Grand Prix. They ended up changing exactly what Charlie Whiting had expressed they needed to change, and Vettel still took pole by a comfortable margin. Despite the fact that Red Bull had gotten out to an early lead, it was clear that the McLaren of Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso's Ferrari were looking pretty racy. All three of the top drivers went into the pit stops around the same time, and it looked like they were all going to be on the same exact strategy. But as it turns out, the Red Bull and the Ferrari decided to convert to a one-stop strategy considering the situation with the tire life. Lewis Hamilton continued with his original strategy. Ultimately, the two-stop strategy was the correct one, of course, because he ended up chasing down pretty easily Sebastian Vettel's car and Fernando Alonso, who Fernando Alonso was passed by not only the Lotus of Romain Grosjean, but also of Sergio Perez. Despite Hamilton's victory in Canada, he was still experiencing some pit lane problems, so that was worth noting as this would continue on throughout the season. And the plot thickens further as Grosjean's P2 effort actually put the Lotus in P2 ahead of the Ferrari now in the Constructors' Championship. With 7 races down, we have 7 different race winners. And here's how the Drivers' Championship looks after those 7 races. You have Hamilton in P1 with 88 points, Alonso right behind him with 86 points, Vettel hot on his tail with 85 points, and Webber, who's had a tough season thus far, still in the hunt at 79 points, Nico Rosberg in the Mercedes at 67 points. Round 8, Valencia. Sebastian Vettel looked to be up to the task to take over the championship in this race. Throughout qualifying, throughout the weekend, throughout the start of the race, he looked like he could run away and just disappear. Something he was doing a lot in 2011. Vettel was fortunate in that he avoided early incidents in a first lap incident. He was then not helped by the fact that there was a virtual safety car deployed, but even after that, he still pulled clear by 20 seconds. As soon as we thought that the 2011 championship car was back, disaster struck. Just as he was pulling off, his alternator broke, and on lap 33, he was out of the Grand Prix. This left Alonso in sole leadership and out in front by a pretty large margin. Romain Grosjean, who had been coming on as of late, started to chase down the double world champion, and on lap 40, his alternator broke. That left Lewis Hamilton, Kimi Räikkönen, and Maldonado in that order, chasing Alonso down. When it was clear that Kimi Räikkönen was going to get through, it was only a matter of time before Maldonado was able to pass Lewis Hamilton. His tires were dying, and Maldonado was quicker. It became evident that he was frustrated with the fact that he was not getting beyond Hamilton and precious time was slipping away, and he was fighting for that podium spot. That reared its ugly head, and they made contact with each other. Maldonado was given post-race a drive-through penalty, and Lewis was knocked out of the race, with Maldonado's nose actually being broken in that incident. All while this is happening, the carnage up front is occurring. Schumacher and Webber are both fighting their way through the entire pack. Had they not been so relentless about this, they would not have been able to place where they did, as Michael Schumacher took his first podium since 2006, and Mark Webber ended up P4, which are very precious points in this kind of battle. It was a very emotional victory for Fernando Alonso. You gotta remember, this is in one of the fiercest battles we've seen in Formula One history. He's the first multi-Grand Prix winner of the entire year of 2012. This is his home race in Valencia. He accomplished this starting P11 on the grid, fighting his way to this victory and earning it. And on top of all that, Vettel's retirement put him in 4th place. So now Fernando Alonso was 26 points in front of Sebastian Vettel. Round 9, Silverstone. It was time for Mark Webber to step back into the spotlight. Alonso's early lead, though, proved to be tough for him. Alonso chose to drive on the harder tires and switch to the soft compounds later, which was the detriment of Alonso at the British Grand Prix. Mark Webber chose to end on the hard tires. That gave him a major lap advantage, and with just 5 laps to go, Mark Webber pulls off a beautiful overtake around the outside long way, down the Wellington Straight, and held on to this position, ultimately until the very end. His Silverstone win put him within a baker's dozen of Alonso's championship lead he had over the field. Those two started to pull away from Sebastian Vettel, who was chasing in 3rd place at the time. Round 10, Germany. Hockenheim gave the entire grid another good show, as we saw Fernando Alonso control most of the race as he had qualified on pole position. More bad news for Hamilton though. On lap 3, he received a puncture and had to pit early. That left Jenson Button with the hopes of McLaren on his back as he chased down the current leader, Fernando Alonso. With Sebastian Vettel very much in this race, he was chasing down Jenson Button trying to make a pass, and he did that. He was successful overtaking him in the hairpin. The issue was this was considered an illegal overtake by the FIA, as he had all 4 tires off the circuit. As such, he was handed a 20-second time penalty. This ended up classifying him in 5th place. This promoted Button to 2nd place and put Kimi on yet another podium in P3. To make matters even worse, the RB8s were yet again accused by the FIA of having some form of illegal alteration to the vehicle. At the time, it was thought that the RB8 had some form of illegal engine mapping. After the race, later, it was determined that this was not the case, but it's worth noting and calling out the fact that that's yet another allegation to the Red Bull car. So now that we're halfway through the season, let's stop and take a look at where we are in the standings. We see Fernando Alonso has a commanding lead of 34 points. The next nearest driver is the Red Bull of Mark Webber. After that, we have Sebastian Vettel, who's 10 points behind his teammate. The driver that was falling behind at this point, going into the 11th round, was Lewis Hamilton. If he was going to stay in contention, he needed to do something, and he needs to do it right now. Round 11, Hungary. Just when you started to count Lewis Hamilton out for the 2012 title hunt, he stepped up in Hungary and delivered a 1st place finish. After taking pole at the Hungarian Grand Prix, he ended up holding that position throughout the entire race. The only time that the leadership actually changed was when Kimi Räikkönen took over during his pit stop strategy, which he executed perfectly. This produced yet another double podium finish by Lotus, with Romain Grosjean actually finishing P3. Despite Alonso failing to win Hungary, he still saw himself distanced from the next nearest driver, while he was 48 points clear of Mark Webber. Round 12, Belgium. After a relatively quiet last couple of Grand Prix in terms of on-track action, we see one of the most famous in terms of the carnage and chaos and just absolute pure pandemonium kickoff at Spa, which is initiated by Romain Grosjean making contact with Lewis Hamilton thinking he's clear. He most certainly was not. This immediately retired himself, Lewis Hamilton, Fernando Alonso, and Sergio Perez. This had major impact and implications on the championship race. Button ended up controlling that race. Sebastian Vettel, despite being P10, fought his way all the way back to P2. Kimi Räikkönen's Lotus saw some questionable decisions as his pit stop strategy left him where he started, P3. The chaos that Grosjean had incidentally kicked off actually left the door open for some pretty remarkable results, as we saw Nico Hülkenberg finish P4 in that race. Jenson Button's victory that day did a lot for him in the championship race, sure, but it also did a lot for Sebastian Vettel, who quietly had been picking up points throughout all of these races. And yet another P2, especially when Alonso was retiring on the first lap after that incident. That left Sebastian Vettel within 24 points of Fernando Alonso. For causing one of the most hectic Grand Prix starts we've ever seen in Formula 1, Romain Grosjean received a race ban, which at the time was pretty rare to get. And he took it pretty hard, but for obvious reasons, also considering he was running pretty well in the championship race himself. He was quoted as saying, "I was sure I was in front of him, so a small mistake made a big incident. I didn't change my line, I went from left to right. I was not really wanting to put anyone into the wall. I'm not here to stop the race in the first corner. I'm very, very sorry, and I'm glad that nobody is hurt. But I have to say, it is a very, very hard decision to hear." Round 13, Italy. We end the European Tour in Monza, of course. Felipe Massa, who's been relatively quiet throughout the season, had a major role to play in this qualifying session in particular. He owed Fernando Alonso the slipstream. Of course, this didn't really go as planned, and Fernando Alonso actually suffered an anti-roll bar failure at the qualifying session. This forced him to qualify and start on the grid P10, but the problems didn't stop here for Ferrari. They actually lost the ability to communicate with the pit wall as it related to their telemetry data as well. Alonso actually went on to get another podium and finish the race in P3. Really, there was only one driver giving Hamilton any trouble after he won the pole in Monza, and it was, of course, Sergio Perez, who was destined, who was driven to get on the podium yet again for a third time in that season. Perez actually started outside of the points, behind Fernando Alonso, but he put on the hard tires and went to work. And his persistence putting in those fast, quick times cut into the lead and pushed him to the front of the grid. And just when McLaren thought they were going to see a double podium, Jenson Button actually experienced a fuel pressure problem. He was knocked out of the race right then and there. Sebastian Vettel's run-ins with the FIA were not over, as he received a drive-through penalty for pushing Fernando Alonso wide off the track. It didn't really matter too much though, because Sebastian Vettel actually experienced another alternator failure like he did a couple Grand Prix ago. Seb wasn't the only Red Bull car to actually retire from Monza that day. Mark Webber was forced to retire. The double retirement from the Red Bull team severely hurt both of their chances, especially Seb's ability to come back and fight in this Drivers' Championship. This looked like the beginning of the end for him, as Lewis Hamilton jumped over not only Kimi Räikkönen, but Sebastian Vettel, and he took over second place in the Drivers' Championship. As it related to the constructors, Hamilton's finish actually pushed McLaren up closer to Red Bull in the Constructors' Championship. The real controversy was about the fact that Lewis Hamilton had just earned another victory with the McLaren, but he was still recovering from his decision to tweet telemetry data from the last race at Spa, when he was upset that Button had a different qualifying setup and significantly better pace throughout qualifying. While the technical problems combined with the fact that the pit crew could not get it together, this was all mounting for Hamilton. The speculation was already there about him talking with Mercedes about leaving McLaren and replacing Schumacher, but if you weren't really sure, despite even winning Monza, after that tweet, he still never really recovered. Revealing your telemetry data to your entire public audience, that's just out of the question, and it would never happen today, but that was really the straw that broke the back for the entire relationship that was already on thin ice. As we close the books on the European stretch of races ending in Monza, we open a new chapter in the Formula 1 2012 schedule. It is at this time when the championship swings wildly in favor of Sebastian Vettel. His stretch of 4 races where he gets 100 championship points. This is not only helpful to his position in the Drivers' Championship, but this is crushing to the entire field, to all of his competition in the 2012 season. We kick off the Asia stretch of races at the Singapore Grand Prix around 14. Sebastian's hopes for a title in 2012 were really helped by the fact that even in Singapore, Hamilton took pole. He was off to a good start, but suffered a gearbox problem while leading the race. This was yet another McLaren issue that just really nailed it home that Lewis was making the right decision by leaving McLaren. And interestingly enough, this Grand Prix was actually cut short due to the time limit, something we don't see too often, but it's because of so many restarts and safety cars. Sebastian Vettel was certainly helped by that. After inheriting the lead from Hamilton and owning all of the restarts, Sebastian Vettel took his first victory since the Bahrain Grand Prix. But he couldn't shake off Alonso just yet. Alonso stood on the podium with him after the Singapore Grand Prix in third place, with Jenson Button splitting the two. Paul di Resta had an incredible result in P4, with Rosberg following just behind him, with the Lotuses going 6 and 7 back-to-back, Kimi leading Roman. And Vettel begins to chip away at this lead that Fernando Alonso has been comfortably sitting on, with 194 points after the Grand Prix. Vettel sitting on 165, with Kimi Räikkönen now bypassing Hamilton with 149 compared to Lewis's 142. Mark Webber brings up the top 5 to 132 points. Hamilton's gearbox failure is responsible for the 2-position change, 2 up by Sebastian Vettel and 2 down seen by Lewis Hamilton. If Vettel was going to use any moment, he was going to use the Singapore Grand Prix as a Rosetta Stone and the launching ground for his championship title fight to start right now, and that it does. Riding the high that he had from Singapore, the Japanese Grand Prix proved to be no different for Vettel, especially in the fact that Alonso had finally started to see some poor luck of his own. His 29-point lead was no longer that comfortable, and it was in dangerous position as he had a first lap DNF due to an incident. As if Mark Webber's title fight couldn't get any more unlucky or unlikely, he was victim of what Romain Grosjean was building up a reputation of doing, knocking people out of the race. Despite a rather rambunctious Grand Prix, Sebastian Vettel remained focused and took another Grand Slam and added that to his tally as he took pole position, led every lap, won the race, and set the fastest lap time of the race. Joining Vettel on the podium at the Japanese Grand Prix were 2 firsts: Felipe Massa's first podium of the 2012 season, also Kobayashi's first podium of his career. Seb's 25 points in Japan were backbreaking to the championship, as now it was closer than we've ever seen it all season long. After Fernando came up empty-handed, his lead is now down to 4 points over Sebastian Vettel, 194 to 190. Kimi Räikkönen remaining steady at 157. Lewis Hamilton's 10 points were good to get him to 152, still behind Kimi, and Mark Webber falling even further behind to 134. The RB8s continued to show their pace, both of them, as we went into round 16, Korea. And while Vettel had all of the momentum, it was Mark Webber who took pole in Korea. Sebastian Vettel at this point just looked unbeatable as he overtook his teammates and never looked back, taking another victory, another 25 championship points in Korea. McLaren has yet another horrific weekend as Lewis Hamilton experiences an anti-roll bar failure, and Jenson Button retired early from the race, having another incident on the first lap. It was that incident that actually led to a prolonged safety car. After that, it just became about tire management. After a front row lockout by the Red Bulls, they finished on the podium 1-2, seeing the pairing of the Ferrari drivers in 3-4, with Alonso taking the third spot on the podium. The championship was now in Sebastian Vettel's hands as he enjoyed a 6-point lead over Fernando Alonso with 2:15 versus 2:09 respectively. Kimi's conservative race kept him in third place with 167 points, while Hamilton was only able to muster the lone point up to 153 points, but 1 point ahead of Mark Webber at 152. Another weekend presented another opportunity for Sebastian Vettel to show his dominance over the field and continue his run as we go to round 17, India. Despite Ferrari's newly announced plan that they would be introducing upgrades to the Ferrari package every single race the rest of the year, it didn't matter because in India, Vettel continued to win. And it would have been his third Grand Slam and his second in just 2 races, but Jenson Button denied him as he took the fastest lap. And while Alonso's drive was still impressive at P2, it's still 7 more points he lost to Vettel. That leaves him 13 points adrift of Sebastian Vettel now, with Kimi Räikkönen in third place with 173 points, Mark Webber with 167, and Lewis Hamilton, though he did get the final spot on that podium that day, he is down to 165, 2 points behind his teammate. Alonso's performance that day was important for the Constructors' Championship as he was able to continue to pad further Ferrari's second place as they go into the next round with 316 points to McLaren's 306. Whereas Red Bull were running away with it with 407 points. The last few Grand Prix were very impressive for Sebastian Vettel, yes, but he didn't really have to overcome much in terms of bad luck. But that was all going to change in Abu Dhabi. He, like Hamilton a few races ago, actually won the qualifying session, but it turns out he did not have enough fuel, so he was relegated to the back of the grid. Red Bull decided to seize this opportunity to just go ahead and add parts and start him from pit lane. They figured Abu Dhabi, it's not really known for being able to overtake. So if we're gonna try to get these points, we really need to add to this car and improve the aero package. You might as well take the full-on penalty starting from pit lane. Not only was Seb's drive good enough for points, It was good enough for a podium as he drove all the way back to P3. This was even after an unplanned stop due to some tire problems, some damage that he had occurred to his front wing. Sebastian really did prove that it wasn't just about luck. He was taking luck into his own hands and he was grabbing those points. In another race, another mechanical failure that Lewis had from the leading position. I mean, the luck Hamilton had and the McLarens had throughout the year, they really were a championship winning car. Just another gutting blow to Hamilton as he had to drop out and retire. Despite Alonso only being good enough for P5 on Saturday, he actually finished on the podium in P2 in the race. The championship was now cut to just two contenders. Sebastian Vettel sitting on 255 points, with Fernando Alonso chasing him with the gap down just to 10 at 245. And while the title fight was incredibly entertaining to watch, it did overshadow the fact that Kimi Räikkönen had an unbelievable race to actually win that Grand Prix. And despite him winning, he was mathematically out of contention for the championship in P3 with 198 points. We head to the brand new Circuit of Americas at the United States Grand Prix for round 19. What was most impressive about Alonso was the fact that Sebastian Vettel actually qualified on pole. This race could have been over in his mind, but he continued to stay and be persistent and fight, and Ferrari was very wise and showed how shrewd they were. The fact that Felipe Massa actually qualified P2, but they purposefully, intentionally broke his gearbox seal. That gave him a penalty, pushed him back 5 spots, and promoted Alonso up from P8 to P7. Because Circuit of Americas was new, the even grid starts, Ferrari were expecting to actually have a really bad start because they were off the racing line. Alonso benefited from that, and they were correct, as his now 7th place grid start actually gave him a significantly better start, which he actually translated into a 3rd place finish, only to be outdone by Sebastian Vettel, who lost a place after his pole to Lewis Hamilton, who finished 1st. 2 men left. 2 world championships for both of them, and just 1 Grand Prix to prove who's better in 2012. We go into round 20, Brazil. The 2012 season ended just like it started, with Lewis Hamilton easily taking pole position, followed by Jenson Button on a front row lockout. Just behind them were the Red Bull pair in 3 and 4 on the qualifying session. And while there was a Ferrari just behind Vettel in P5, it wasn't Fernando Alonso. He actually qualified good enough for P8. Neither of the title fighters looked good, but it looked over for Fernando Alonso. He was going to have to make up a lot of ground. This was going to be particularly tough at Interlagos in wet conditions. And as we've learned throughout this entire video, the 2012 season was anything but squeaky clean and simple. Sebastian Vettel's 4-place advantage evaporated in an instant, in what could only be described as nightmarish by a Red Bull fan. Sebastian Vettel did the unthinkable. The worst had happened. He had a first lap spin due to contact. While it appeared his car was in one piece and was able to drive just fine, he was in dead last. And to make matters even worse, Fernando Alonso had actually promoted himself through his driving, even through lap 2 to P5. And while Alonso was shoring up his positions, making sure to get as high as he possibly could to get the padding he needed, Sebastian Vettel was busy at work making as many passes as humanly possible. As cars were dropping out left and right, Sebastian Vettel was overtaking people left and right. Vettel had actually made his way all the way up to P4 behind Fernando Alonso. After some debris on the track and a restart, Vettel actually dropped back a little bit more as the dry conditions started to expose his lack of pace from the damage and his tire selection. And when it rained, it really did pour for Lewis Hamilton and on his 2012 season, as he was knocked out of the race by contact from Nico Hülkenberg, giving his own teammate the lead in the Brazilian Grand Prix. As if you couldn't be on the edge of your seat more, Sebastian Vettel actually didn't have radio communications with his pit wall at the time. So when it started to rain, he made the decision to come in immediately, and his team was absolutely not ready for him. This caused a delay he did not need at the time. Sebastian emerged in 7th place, who, not having radio at the time, was good enough for the championship. Meanwhile, Ferrari did a wonderful job maximizing Alonso's track position, getting him in 2nd place after that stop. But he was going to have to catch Jenson Button if he wanted the championship. He would never end up getting that opportunity, as Paul di Resta crashed at the control line, finishing the race under safety car. The conclusion of the Brazilian Grand Prix was rather muted for such an eventful and exciting championship season. But regardless of how it ended, what no one can take away from Sebastian, from Alonso, from anyone on the field that year, no one was handed a point. No inch was given. Everyone fought tooth and nail for everything, despite the odds and the circumstances. Vettel was quoted after as saying, "Where do you start, really? I think you guys had your show, and we had to really fight until the end." Seb's candor and interview after that Grand Prix was something I'll personally never forget, and was the inspiration for this video. because it really was the last time I felt like Formula One was a show, was entertaining. You never really knew what was going to happen. And in honor of that, in honor of the drivers that year, in honor of the performances, the comebacks, 2012 for me really was the greatest season of living legends we've ever had in Formula One. My only goal, my true objective with this video is to reciprocate that. Hopefully you were entertained. Hopefully you see the 2012 season for what it was. And hopefully we won't have to wait that long until we get something like that again. This single piece of content took north of 50 hours to make for you, between the research, between the writing of the script itself, between the recording, between the video editing and production and final output. This is a lot of work, but I do it because I'm a fan and I want to entertain you guys. So if you like this video, make sure to subscribe, share it if I earned it, like and leave a comment. All of that is really powerful in helping this channel grow. And the more our channel grows, the more production value I can add to each video, the more content I can create, and I can make it much quicker. So with that said, thank you all for your time. Cheers to 2012. Hope for more like it, and I'll see you all very soon. Well done, Seb.